You have to be in control of your emotions. You have to take a step back and you have to go, I'm not going to react. This person is pressuring me. They're saying these things. My natural tendency is to react, get my back up and bite back. No, I'm going to step back and I'm going to go, what's going to make them shut the fuck up? What's going to make them get out of my life? What's going to get rid of them? What's going to defeat them? If they're an adversary, I made that decision not to react, to get emotional. All right, now I have to think. If I do this, they're going to react this way. But if I surprise them with this angle, they won't know what to do, and then they'll react in a different way, and I'll be in control of the situation. I strategize. I go through a process of gaming out the possibilities here, and that's to be a strategist. Most of us, the 95% of us who aren't sharks, and I'm including myself in that category, it's very, very disturbing to suddenly enter that world and see all of that invisible power games on that no one's given you any advice for or helped you. And so take it out of the realm of it's just about trying to dominate the world and manipulate and exploit and abuse. It's something inside of you. You have this need, and your suppression of it will only make you come out in passive ways. And you won't be able to control certain things. If you want to move people, if you want them to follow your ideas, if you want them to be more aligned with your politics or your ideas, you have to be subtle. You have to learn psychology. You have to learn certain aspects of how to almost move people without them realizing in certain directions, which is like the art of seduction. And if you're not interested in that, if you're just going to tell people what you think and what you're going to do, that means you're not interested in practical action. You're not interested in results. You're just interested in venting your own frustrations or your own anger. So learning the subtle little dynamics of power is extremely essential because we're a social animal. It doesn't mean that you're going to get dirty, that you're going to suddenly go out there and manipulate the hell out of people. Most of the 48 laws of power is about defense. But how to defend yourself from the sharks out there, how to defend yourself from making classic mistakes, like outshining the master, like talking too much, like arguing with people instead of demonstrating your ideas, on and on and on. It's not an ugly thing. It actually makes you a better social individual. So that's how I like to frame it.
It's very interesting. I think as a young guy growing up, it was so important to me to know where I fit in with my friend group. And I didn't think of it so much as a hierarchy, nor when I was in my academic studies did I think of it as a hierarchy, even though it clearly was, right? So much as the goal was to figure out where was my unique slot that I could do the most good for myself and others.
Right.
Kind of finding my spot. I don't want to say on a shelf because it gives an image of something vertical, but let's make it lateral, lateral arrangement of different people with different strengths, different life purposes, trying to figure them out. Where should I be in order to express that and also feel connected to others? And in order to do that, I realize now, based on your answer, I did have to figure out, who's trying to have power over, who's pretending that they don't want power, but is actually exerting power, these sorts of things. And there's an incredible peace that comes from knowing that one is in the correct place, both profession, interpersonally, in relation to oneself, but also in the context of one's peer group. It's kind of knowing, this is where I belong. Because trying to gain power when one is trying to move to a position that isn't right for them or in a way that isn't right for them just seems so energetically costly.
Yeah.
It seems like a waste of a life, frankly.
Right.
Trying to gather resources simply to have them, to give the illusion of power, but then being afraid of losing them just sounds like a recipe for misery, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
Whereas figuring out where am I most powerful in the benevolent sense of the word, that seems like a good pursuit.
Well, it's connecting up to mastery again and finding your life's purpose. I knew when I was young that I couldn't exert physical power because I was a skinny little runt, and I wasn't bullied, but people would kind of pick on me, et cetera, et cetera. So I veered towards intellectual pursuits where I could have power. And in the end, you might have been a jock and you might have done well in high school, but look at me now. I'm not saying that it's a beautiful thing. But that's part of human nature, the desire to actually, prove yourself and find that niche that you belong to, so you don't have that kind of that sense of inferiority, which Alfred Adler, the psychologist, describes very eloquently. So a lot of it is kind of compensating when you're a child for things that are your weaknesses and finding what you're so good at that you do have that power and people can't bully you, right? And you're like now a famous neuroscientist, whereas they're like, who knows what they're doing kind of thing. So power definitely is connected in some way to that inner sense of what you were meant to do. And you feel it with the ease and the connection that comes from it, right? So I can honestly say that my dislike of working for other people and office politics and egos, I now have an existence where I don't have to deal with any of that. And I'm so blessed, and I wake up every morning and I pray to God, thank God I found this, because it's the perfect lifestyle for me.
And you can be accurately described as an intellectual beast. So it's which is like a compliment, right? We hear the word beast and we think a ferocious beast trying to harm others. But
I'm happy being a beast.
Yeah, and so I think finding where we can be a beast, and for some people that's painting or gardening or whatever it might be. I think is again ties back to these issues of or this quest for mastery. Seduction is also a very loaded word, right?
It's even more uglier than power.
Because seduction kind of drips with the idea that somebody is tricking someone else into doing something that they otherwise would not want to do. But seduction is both our propensity to do it and to have it done to us is hardwired into our nervous system and has a lot to do with the hypothalamus and a bunch of other areas that I won't bore us with the nomenclature. But seduction, to me, implies some sort of exchange. I suppose we could seduce ourselves through denial or convincing ourselves of something. But more often than not, when we talk about seduction, we're talking about an interaction between two or more people. So what are some of the core principles of seduction? And if you care to play anthropologist a bit and a neuroscientist, I would invite that. Why do you think we have neural circuits in our brain that allow us to seduce and be seduced?
Well, I don't know how if I'm being kind of an armchair intellectual here, but my theory is some of it has to go back to social events long in our prehistory, which have to do with taboos. And society was initially kind of organized by a series of taboos, right? Most notably the taboo on incest. And what happened, this is just not my theory, it's the theory of the Malinowski is that I pronounce it, is that the moment a taboo enters the human brain, like you're not supposed to sleep with this woman, the desire arises inside of you to actually sleep with that woman. The sense of no, the sense that this is prohibited, stirs the desire, stirs the contrary impulses in humans. And we can be very, perverse creatures, right? So if you've ever tried to suppress a thought, you'll realize that it keeps coming up. It keeps coming up. You can't suppress it. Don't think of an elephant, Andrews. Whatever you do, don't think of an elephant. You're thinking of it because you can't help it, right? The idea that you're not supposed to desire this person stirs that actual desire. So I believe the sense of something being taboo and transgressive is the ultimate kind of origin of our desire for seduction. But seduction involves vulnerability. It involves somebody gets inside, somebody gets under our skin, right? And to do that, we have to let them in. So the person being seduced is in some ways to a degree complicit. Because if you just put up a wall and you said, no, I'm not going to be seduced, nothing will happen. But you have a vulnerability. You're letting that person into your psyche, into your inner space. The paradigm for that is early childhood. So Freud talks a lot about this. So I don't know if people still believe in Freud anymore.
I certainly do.
Okay.
Absolutely. But genius of both psychology and physiology. Wrong
sure.
about a lot of things, did a lot of things he shouldn't have done. Let's acknowledge that. I think everyone would agree that sleeping with your patients and being a cocaine addict, bad ideas. But at the same time, he had an absolute, like near supernatural levels of insight and brilliance into human nature.
Did he sleep with his patients?
I believe he did. But if I just threw that on him without him doing it, then, forgive me.
He certainly had emotional attachments to his patients that he shouldn't have had. I don't know if he slept with them. He very well might have. But his idea was that the child is seduced by the parent. You're in an extremely vulnerable position, right? Your life depends on them. And they're seducing you with their energy. You're letting them in, right? And that kind of creates a pattern for the rest of your life. And so, for instance, the feeling of being carried by your father and just being taken around physically is a form of seduction because you don't know what he's going to do to you. You're very excited. You want that surprise, right? And to me, it's related to the seduction of a story. Stories are very seducing to us. We don't know where they're taking us. We don't know what the next chapter is, what's going to happen to this character or not. The surprise lowers our resistance and opens our mind up to what's going to happen next, is a form of seduction. Fairy tales, the stories you were reading as a child, your interactions with your parents, they're deeply, deeply ingrained in you. You cannot be seduced unless you are vulnerable, right? And so I like to switch it around and get it out of the negative connotations. Being vulnerable is actually a positive trait. I think a lot of people now in the world today, because things are so harsh and invasive, that people have become too invulnerable. They don't want to let anything in, right? And this now infects their relationships with other people. They don't want to be influenced. They want to be strong inside of themselves. They're afraid of giving in to the other person, of surrendering to their influence. But it's actually a delightful feeling to surrender to the power of another person and then reverse that charge and have them surrender to your power. So when I'm reading a writer, and sometimes they completely seduce me, like Friedrich Nietzsche is one of my favorite writers. I let go of everything. I let him enter my brain, and I'm completely seduced. I let him lead me along. But then I encounter writers that I don't like at all. I'll mention one, it's probably not a good thing, but Steven Pinker. I don't like Steven Pinker. I find him really annoying, okay? But I force myself to try and find a way to be seduced by him, to let him into my brain, to see where he's coming from, to open myself to the possibility that he could be correct. So vulnerability, letting people into your mental space, is a form of intelligence. It's a kind of an emotional and an intellectual intelligence.
And forgive me for interrupting, but I think it also implies a level of confidence, because empathy, or allowing oneself to be vulnerable to the point where you're seduced by something, by definition, if you're choosing to do it, implies that you also have the confidence that you can get back to yourself afterward.
Of course.
Right? That you're not going to get lost
Of
in the
course.
circumstances. That you're not going to be hijacked to the point of no return.
Right.
Or in some way that's detrimental to you.
That's right.
So it's I'm sounding really nerdy here. It's collinear with confidence in many ways. Sure, like take my mind and take it where you will, because I know I can come back at any time.
Right, right. And the same thing in a physical seduction, in a romantic sense, right? You're opening yourself up to the charm, to the energy of the other person. But if they start displaying dark energy and you see that they're abusive or something is wrong, you have the ability to retreat.
Well, there it gets tricky.
It gets very tricky.
Well, because the attachment systems, which are also rooted in childhood, oftentimes can overwhelm one's ability to recover oneself. How many? If I had $1 for every time someone that I knew in my life saying, like, I know they're bad for me, but I just can't. Like, we just can't seem to disengage. Like that, you hear about that all the time. I mean, you see court cases about this that are public, and you just go, why didn't they just walk away from one another? Well, because once those attachment systems are locked in, it almost becomes, and here metaphorically speaking, like a parent-child relationship. Like, you can't suddenly decide your parents weren't your parents,
right,
simply because you know better now. Right? You are forever stricken with the reality that they were, and they had an influence. And I think that attachment system is a force that tugs pretty hard.
Yeah, and a lot of women have written to me since The Art of Seduction, sort of saying that their boyfriend or husband was applying some of these tactics on them, and it was very painful, and they were kind of a little bit angry at me for it. But then they kind of realized that they didn't learn it really from my book. It was already kind of wired in them. But that reading about these tactics and these strategies actually helped them to recognize what their husband or boyfriend was doing to them, the manipulation and the games that were being played.
Do men write to you and talk about the seductive adornments that women have used to bring them into relationship as well, or are you typically hearing from women?
I mostly hear from women complaining about men and how they've abused them and how they use some of the strategies. I don't deny have a slightly nefarious edge to them, because I didn't want to write a book about seduction that doesn't have that taboo element, because I say seduction involves the taboo, and I didn't want to censor myself.
But female to male seduction clearly also exists.
Very much
It's
so.
less often. I acknowledge that it's less often is it physically abusive, but right. I mean, from an early age, both boys and girls, men and women, are coached by society on the sorts of seductive tactics and adornments, right? I mean, everything from makeup, perfume, hairstyles, cars, watches, jewelry, expression, power displays of any kind. I mean, that stuff, the world's filled with that stuff.
Yeah, but men are generally kind of happy when a woman seduces them, right? Unless they're after their money or something like that, which happens. But generally the sense, I talk about this in the first chapter about sirens, which I say is the quintessential archetype of the female seductress, the kind of half human, half bird creature on a rock singing so beautifully that you have to jump in the water and then they kill you. And so the idea is that men want to let go because men have to be so in control, so powerful. They have to project this image. They have a secret desire to let go and be almost dominated by a very powerful woman. A lot of men have that. And I talk about some of the most powerful men in history: Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Joe DiMaggio, all these men, very masculine men who've fallen for very feminine, siren-like women and been completely dominated by them. And they actually kind of enjoy the process because it's like a sense of, I can let go. I can enter this totally sensual physical world, and it's extremely pleasing. It's like another realm outside of my kind of cold, masculine world, So I don't really get men complaining too much about women who've seduced them, honestly. It's usually the other way around.
I'd like to take a quick break and thank our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you reach your health goals. Now, I've long been a believer in getting regular blood work done for the simple reason that many of the factors that impact your immediate and long-term health can only be analyzed from a quality blood test. Now, a major problem with a lot of blood tests out there, however, is that you get information back about metabolic factors, lipids, and hormones, and so forth, but you don't know what to do with that information. With Inside Tracker, they make it very easy because they have a personalized platform that allows you to see the levels of all those things, metabolic factors, lipids, hormones, etc., but it gives you specific directives that you can follow that relate to nutrition, behavioral modification, supplements, etc., that can help you bring those numbers into the ranges that are optimal for you. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can go to insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. Again, that's insidetracker.com/Huberman. I've heard before, and I promise this is not an original idea that I'm pretending to have heard elsewhere, that my friend asked me to ask sort of question, that in all sexual exchanges, there's a power exchange.
Definitely.
Maybe you could elaborate on that, because as you were describing some of the seductive power dynamics that exist, a phrase that I've heard before came to mind that at first made me chuckle, but then made me think quite deeply about this issue of the relationship between sexual and power dynamics, which is this notion of topping from the bottom. If one is giving someone else the impression that they are more powerful, by virtue of the word giving, they actually hold some power, right? Power can be given or taken, but oftentimes seductive exchanges and sexual exchanges and romantic exchanges in particular are about both people buying into a a temporary illusion. Let's pretend that you're in charge when actually I'm in charge. Okay, but I know that you think that you're in charge. Okay, let's just pretend none of that exists and just do X, right? And I think this is another example of covert contracts. And it's one that actually can potentially create a lot of problems post hoc, right? But I think the relationship between sex, romance, and power is an important area to explore in the context of this.
Well, I wrote The Art of Seduction with the idea that it was an art invented by women. It was invented by women who had no power, essentially, socially, politically, in any sense of the word, in domestically, right? But the one power that they could wield over a man was through sex, some physical attraction. And so they developed this art of kind of luring a man into their world through various theatrical effects, Cleopatra being kind of the archetype of this, and then luring the powerful man into this world. He has the illusion that he's the one pursuing her, but in fact, she is the one controlling the dynamic. So oftentimes the person who appears to be the weaker one in the relationship, who's not doing the pursuing, is actually inviting the pursuing, is actually leading the other person on. So there's a lot of kind of appearance games going on, and you can never really figure out who exactly is in control of the dynamic. Because one person is like allowing the other person to lead them on, but the fact that you're allowing them is a degree of power, is a degree of control, right? So it's very hard to figure out. And sex and power and romantic relationships are very much intertwined in us, physically, emotionally, neurologically. You can't avoid it, right? And so I think it's kind of dishonest to say that none of that exists, that it's like that there's some egalitarian paradise out of there when it's really not wired in us for that kind of relationship.
There's a recent scientific publication / factoid that I wanted to share with you in this context because I'd like your thoughts on it. David Anderson, who's a phenomenal neurobiologist, he's been a guest on this podcast before. He's a professor at Caltech, studies basically the functions of the hypothalamus. So things like aggression, mating, and things of that sort, and does it with great detail. He's a virtuoso of the hypothalamus. And he published a paper 2 years ago showing that indeed there are neural circuits in the brain of animals and presumably in humans as well that control sexual mounting behavior, but that there is actually a separate circuit for purely non-sexual mounting and physical power over that's expressed in animals. And anyone that's ever owned a dog and gone to the dog park will see same-sex mounting between dogs or mounting between dogs that has apparently no sexual endpoint.
Yeah.
And in exploring this literature and some talking to David about it, it's very clear that there are neural circuits that have everything to do with essentially one animal of a species getting on top of the other animal, usually from behind, oftentimes scruffing or biting the back of the neck, and saying, I control you. It's often done in a playful context, especially between animals, not always aggressive, but there's a certain element of aggressive to it. But it essentially says, I decide whether or not you are mobile or not for this moment. And and this is very important, I want to emphasize this is a circuit that is entirely separate from all of the reflexes associated with sexual behavior in males and females. I find this to be fascinating. And because we hear about power over, right? And we hear about power and we think about physical power over. But the idea that something as primitive as mounting, just like something as primitive as biting or as striking, has its own unique set of circuits in the brain, I think substantiates everything that you put in your books about power and maybe even seduction as well. So as I just kind of toss that out there for consideration, I wonder if you have any reflections on it. If not, feel free to just say, I don't, but of course. But to me, this was a really important discovery because I think everyone looks at mounting behavior and says, oh, that has to be sexual. And sometimes it's...
I see what you mean.
But it's not. That there seem to be a host of neural circuits in the brain that are really about defining who's on top, literally, that has nothing to do with sex.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I've never read anything about that, but I can say that I wrote a chapter in my new book about love, and that's a different thing than seduction. And I was trying to come up with an idea of love that does have an element of equality, that doesn't have this power dynamic going on in it.
Oh, I love that.
And kind of like the antithesis of my art of seduction, where I'm almost contradicting myself. And I was going into the biology of it and even into the physics of it. So there's a famous French biologist whose name escapes me. Sorry, I can't remember, from the 20s and 30s. And he was studying paramecium. And he was studying them, they're in these ponds, etc. And he said that there was these moments where these single-celled organisms were suddenly coupling. They were all joining together, just one to one, and they were absorbing the membrane of one inside the other. And then they would and then once one couple did that, all the paramecium started joining up together. Then they would sink to the bottom of the pond. And paramecium don't reproduce through sex. They reproduce through dividing themselves, right? Self-reproduction. And so he was saying that the desire to couple, to connect to someone so deeply where you absorb, one is absorbed in the other, is biologically wired into us. Goes back millions and millions and millions of years. And it's a desire, essentially, a biological desire for love, right? And it's an energy that permeates although it's not just about power and hierarchies, and that he was showing other creatures that had something similar going on. And, in physics, we talk about entanglement, and we also talk about, matter. If matter isn't opposed by a lot of kinetic energy, it joins together. Particles join together to form matter, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something in the universe that's trying to connect things to each other. So there's this kind of energy that exists in the world where we have a deep need to connect to somebody outside of those power dynamics, right? Where there's a degree of equality, where we're drawn to each other, and we let go of the ego games, we let go of the playing, we kind of surmount our own physiology, our own hypothalamus, and we engage in this, I call it love sublime. And it involves the physical part. The sexual part is the trigger for it. Because when you have sex with someone, your body is suddenly permeable to their energy in a way that you cannot control. It releases all kinds of chemicals in the brain that are very powerful. And oftentimes that sense is too powerful and you react and you're afraid of it and you pull back. But if you don't react and you go further, then the mind also becomes permeable to the other person and their energy and their desire. And so then it kind of creates a spiraling effect where the physical and the mental connection reaches this state that I call love sublime. Now, it's an ideal. It doesn't really exist that much out there in the world today, but there are stories in history that illustrate it, and I believe that is a biological necessity for us to feel a deep, deep sense of connection. We normally ascribe that to religion, to God, etc. But I maintain the essence of love, the model for love, is between two human beings, straight or homosexual, doesn't matter. And that feeling of surmounting our own neurology, our own system, and entering this zone is deeply, deeply satisfying. We all want it. And it has to involve letting go of the power dynamics, and everything being equal. It's not that the other person is exactly like you. You recognize their difference. But as far as being worthy of attention, as being worthy and respected, you leave all of that other stuff outside. So there is a zone that's possible that's outside this power dynamic that we're talking about.
I'm excited that you're writing about this. So this is for your next book.
Yeah.
I'm very excited. I couldn't help but think of some of the parallels between what you describe and what we're observing nowadays in the landscape of politics and social dynamics, where clearly there is no setting aside of egos. People feel both sides feel attacked. Everyone in between feels confused, like, why do I have to pick a side? And there seems to be no hint of a future where people are setting down their swords, which means, if we were to go with your earlier definition, which I like a lot, that nobody feels safe enough to be vulnerable enough to allow the union of people to occur, which is just a way of rewording, a bunch of other things, and not nearly as eloquently as you described it. But if setting aside of power dynamics and making oneself vulnerable is the key to accessing love in the romantic context, surely, but also in the societal context. I mean, what are the channels for that? I mean, I suppose there is the argument, not mine, that everyone should just take a boatload of psychedelics and see the interconnectedness of things. But that seems like an unrealistic route. I just don't see that being, 12th grade graduation curriculum. Nor do I think it would be healthy. To be clear, I think that we'd end up with a lot of expression of problems there. But short of a magic substance that could increase feelings of connectedness among everyone simultaneously, how are you going to save humanity, Robert?
Well, because I'm concerned about young people in particular with hookup culture, with pornography, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of rewiring the human brain, and we're losing what I was just describing. And I see particularly a lot of young people, and I don't blame them because they've grown up in a world that's very chaotic and very hostile.
Could I say, I think it's, and not to be nitpicky here, but I love what you just said. I think, in my mind, things like that are hijacking the hardwiring of the brain.
Okay.
And I'm
right,
just,
right.
no, and I'm not, again,
true.
Forgive me, the audience is probably going, oh,
You can't really rewire the brain
right.
like that. So.
Well, I think we can expand and rewire upon our hardwiring, but so much of what you talk about in your books is about finding one's essence, but then also what I love about your books so much, among many other things, is that it's about that dance between the hardwiring and the possible of through effort. So anyway, forgive me for being...
No, it's very accurate.
So yeah, how do you get us out of this?
Well, you're putting a big burden on me.
I am, but I think you're up to it.
Well, I try to do it in this chapter because I wanted to seduce the reader into the idea that this is something extremely pleasurable and extremely healthy. And the feeling of being vulnerable is a very positive attribute that will infect not just your romantic relationships, but will infect you mentally. So creative people are extremely vulnerable. They're extremely vulnerable to ideas. They're extremely vulnerable to the environment. And closing yourself off into your own ego, into yourself. So the chapter is called Escape the Prison of the Ego. And you're kind of trapped inside of yourself and your own thoughts and your own desires. And it's like a prison. It's enclosing you, and you want to escape somehow. And you escape through drugs, you escape through porn, but it doesn't lead to actually escaping. You want to be able to let go of the self and get out of this prison that you're in, right? And so it's a desire that we all have. And so I wanted to frame it as this incredibly positive dynamic that you can engage in. And the ability to be vulnerable to other people, to open yourself up and to say that, yeah, they might hurt me, but I'm strong enough to take it. And if they hurt me, I'll learn from it and I'll rebound.